about in several classes before here, we've looked at some of the major environmental and social problems that we're facing, issues related to, peak oil or peak fossil fuels, obviously all of the ecological crises that have come about because of this one-time boom of fossil fuel inputs that has driven our society for the last 200 years or so. But what we haven't talked about, I think, perhaps on enough of a level, is what's going to happen, as some of the necessary changes that we're confronting are going to happen. We're going to look at, obviously there's all of these issues related to, what happens when fossil fuels begin to decline, what happens if ecological crises such as global warming we're not able to come up with a solution to that or make the necessary changes. And what happens to societies when in the past, and how can we learn from them? So as real briefly, the outline of my class is I want to talk about the issue of societal collapse, looking at four different kind of areas. One, current events that we've touched on briefly in past classes, but I want to look a little bit more in depth at how some of these current events threaten the idea of societal collapse. I want to also look at the coming energy de-escalation. What's going to happen in the future when we inevitably have less energy than what we have today? How are we going to respond to that, and how does that look? I also want to look briefly at the idea of the archaeology and the historical evidence of how other societies have collapsed. I think a lot of times, especially with our kind of Hollywood-esque type of ethic, and especially how the media looks at things, the idea of how societies in the past have collapsed has always been dramatized. It's been kind of made this great collapse where all of a sudden these great civilizations just disappeared, and that's not necessarily true. So we're going to look at how societies in the past have collapsed, why they did, and how they responded to that. And then we're also going to look at the complexity thesis. What is the complexity thesis? Especially there's an author that we're going to introduce called Joseph Tainter, and how that has applied to societal collapse in the past and how it might apply to our society today. And then finally, I want to look at how all of this is relevant and related to the idea of community development. Specifically, why rural communities throughout the world might be best poised and best adapted to the coming Great Simplification, right? And so I think what I'm going to argue is that a lot of the development work, community development work that is going on around the world today, I think is misdirected, because most of the development programs and where most of the money is being sent to is to try and make rural communities, impoverished communities, more like the high energy societies that we live in today, places like the United States, Western Europe, and all of these pockets of wealth around the world. And the idea is that this is what works, and we need to try and enforce, this paradigm in the rest of the world. But given the evidence that I hope to present about, all of the instabilities, all of the unsustainabilities that go with our modern day society, perhaps we need to rethink how we're going to act as development organizations in these rural communities, instead of trying to push them towards systems that are clearly unsustainable, that may be already failing. Maybe we need to look at what has worked, what essences of sustainability still exist in these rural communities, and how can we potentiate them? How can we help rural communities to rescue traditional lifestyles, to improve upon traditional lifestyles, to adapt to a low energy future, which is what we might be coming to. Okay. But before we get started, I want to mention real quick what collapse is not. And so in the United States, in other parts of the world, when the idea of collapse is mentioned, I think a lot of people get this idea of what many people refer to as prepping or preppers. And in the United States and other parts of the world, there are lots of perhaps wealthy people who are maybe on the conservative end of the political spectrum, who probably have, I would say perhaps, decently founded fears that things are not going right. They might not trust certain government policies. They might not trust the economic system in which we're living. They might actually, have some fears about, what might happen if global warming, is not fixed or is not brought under control. And so these preppers, a lot of people are buying up huge amounts of guns, building these underground bunkers, creating these fortified communities, and have this idea that when the poop hits the fan, as they say, they're going to be prepared and defend themselves from the mobs that are going to inevitably arise. That's not what I'm talking about. Everybody can make their own judgments on those types of people and their reactions. I think that in a sense, that type of reaction is perhaps relevant and perhaps shows that there is a profound unease amongst huge portions of the global population, people who I think understand that we have been moving in an unsustainable direction that might be leading us towards societal collapse. But this type of response is I think is what makes a lot of academics and people around the world not want to talk realistically about what is happening, if our society is in fact collapsing, and what might be the response to that. But let's, going on to that, moving on with that example of this kind of fortified, conservative, big gun response to collapse. Here's an interesting, a few interesting case scenarios, things that are happening. So there are ultra elite, there are billion-dollar companies out there who specialize in building ultra elite shelters. So there's one in the Czech Republic known as the Opidium. It's called the largest billionaire bunker in the world, and it includes amenities that simulate natural sunlight, a wine vault, a place to hide all your stuff that's impregnable to hostile outsiders. And so it's actually pretty interesting. There is information that recently came out about how many of the world's most famous or infamous billionaires around the world have invested millions of dollars in bunkers located around different parts of the world. That might sound kind of, again, Hollywood-esque, but it's true. And I think that, that might, I would say, people who have benefited, extremely benefited from the modern day industrial capitalist system in which we live, are the ones who fear that it is failing, which I think is telling, right? And they're spending millions of dollars to try and protect themselves and their families and their loved ones if societal collapse were to occur. One of the more interesting examples of this is Sam Altman. He is the CEO, the founder of OpenAI, which you all might know better as the company that runs and founds ChatGPT, that was released earlier this year and has been downloaded by hundreds of millions of people around the world. A couple years ago, before Sam Altman really jumped into the national conscience, he was still the founder of OpenAI, and they were working on these ChatGPT systems, the earlier versions of them. And so he was interviewed by a tech magazine, and the question was, they started to talk about bunkers and the risks of what might happen if artificial intelligence were to grow beyond the control of the programmers. And the question was, when would you use your bunker? And he says, when a super contagious virus takes over the world, or when artificial intelligence begins to attack humans. And this is a quote from him. I try not to think about it too much, Altman told just months after founding OpenAI with Elon Musk. But I have weapons. I have gold. I have potassium iodide, antibiotics, batteries, water, Israel Defense Force gas masks, and a large piece of land and big sewer, a part of California, that I can fly to. And again, this is fascinating because he is worried about collapse occurring due to artificial intelligence systems that might wreck our financial system or grow beyond the control of the programmers, really have no idea what might happen. And this is, again, the founder of one of the most powerful artificial intelligence systems that has been released to the public, publicly admitting that he has a bunker and that he's, trying to protect himself if the systems that he is creating grow beyond his control. I think that is interesting. But beyond, these types of responses, right? These conservative, people who are buying up guns, or these billionaires building bunkers, or these billionaires who are afraid of the systems that they're creating. There's also an academic response to collapse. At the University of Oxford, which is one of the more respected universities in Europe, Toby ORD is a professor who heads what they call the Future of Humanity Institute. Now, this is a book that he wrote a couple of years ago. And he, along with the Future of Humanity Institute, essentially looked at what were some of the most potent existential risks that humanity faces. And they defined existential risks, as fairly widely. For example, kind of like what happened to the dinosaurs, we don't know. It could happen that a massive meteor could strike the Earth, kind of like the movie, the famous Leonardo DiCaprio movie that came out, Don't Look Up. They also said, there's all these threats about supervolcanic eruptions that could massively change the climate of the Earth. But they looked at a wide variety of potential existential risks that humanity faces. And at the end of his book, and at the end of Toby ORD is a mathematician, and at the end of trying to look at all of these existential risks, the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford has determined that humanity has a 1 in 6 chance of extinguishing ourselves within the next century. You might say that that's kind of perhaps exotic numbers, or maybe alarmist, but I think it's interesting that this is a number that's not coming from a fringe website operated by some preppers who have a bunker in Idaho or anything like that. This is a number from one of the most distinguished universities in the world. The institute, the Humanity Institute, Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, focuses particular attention on biotech and artificial intelligence, which are some of the most prominent areas of concern for what might happen in some of the existential risks we face. There's a few really interesting statistics that he quotes. And for example, he says that the Biological Weapons Convention, which is the only global agreement that is meant to protect humanity against the use of biological weapons, has 4 employees and a smaller budget than the average McDonald's. So that shows you how much money is being invested in finding ways to protect humanity from the use of biological weapons that could cause human-caused pandemics. Toby ORD and the Future of Humanity Institute also says that climate change is obviously an existential threat that could be leading to societal collapse. One of the statistics that they quote in the book is that if we eventually burn all of the fossil fuels that we're confident we can access, the leading Earth system models suggest we experience between 9 and 13 degrees Celsius of warming by 2300. If you've heard of some of the IPCC reports, up till now, we're pretty much locked in to an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius, perhaps 2 degrees Celsius. And we're already beginning to see massive storms, prolonged droughts, wildfires, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine what would happen if we were to move that number from 1.5 to 13 degrees Celsius. And I think it's interesting that they say that if we do burn the fossil fuels that we can access every year, we are burning, despite all of these conventions, the Paris Convention, the Copenhagen Accords, despite all of these, we continue to burn every year more and more fossil fuels. We continue to explore more fossil fuels. As the Arctic sea begins to thaw, there's already a race for which countries are going to access the previously unaccessible fossil fuels that were buried underneath the ice. We're not changing. And so if we do not change, and if we continue along this path, obviously climate change and all of the feedback loops that are associated with that could obviously prevent very, very real extinction risks, not only for us as human beings, but for thousands of other species as well. Another thing that the book talks about is that this was actually written pre-COVID, which is interesting, but he said that pandemics and bioweapons are another very, very serious risk that could lead to societal collapse. Here's a couple Statistics in 2007, the foot and mouth disease, which is a high-risk pathogen that can only be studied in labs following top level of biosecurity, escaped from a research facility, leading to an outbreak in the UK. And an investigation found that the virus had escaped from a badly maintained pipe. After repairs, the lab's license was renewed, only for another leak to occur 2 weeks later. 7 years later, in 2014, one of the major pharmaceutical companies, GlaxoSmithKline, accidentally released 45 liters of concentrated poliovirus into a river in Belgium. In 2004, SARS escaped from the National Institute of Virology. In 2005, the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey, 3 mice were infected with the bubonic plague, and they were never found again. The book takes a look at all of the research that's being done into viruses. A lot of it, which is obviously very important, very necessary, but there are not the necessary safety protocols. I don't want to get into whether COVID was caused by a market in China or whether it was accidentally released from a lab in China, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There seems to be fairly convincing evidence of both cases. But what the book says is that there are not adequate safety measures in place for all of the research that's being that's going on. And if we're not careful, obviously, what happened in 2020 and 2021 with COVID has shown us, how fastly and how quickly our world system can be developed. And unfortunately, that's still going on. And that's not even taking into consideration bioweapons. One of the things that I read an interesting report about, there's artificial intelligence all of these artificial intelligence systems, which are not regulated as of yet, can essentially tell people how to create their own bioweapons. You can plug in a question and ChatGPT can tell you, how to create this potentially lethal bioweapon that you could then release into the public, with all terrorist organizations, etc. That's dangerous. And like I said, that is another threat of collapse, another threat of extinction level, issues that we're facing. And then lastly, one that is perhaps a bit newer into the public discourse is the idea of artificial intelligence. We mentioned here Sam Altman, the guy who created ChatGPT, and some of his beliefs and fears with the systems that he's creating. But the book that I mentioned earlier, Toby ORD's book, said that on the power and potential of AI, scientists could create systems that surpass human intelligence. And he views unaligned artificial intelligence as the highest existential risk that humanity faces. There's all of these. One of the things I think is interesting is that, all of these companies that are developing AI systems today have been repeatedly calling for a global moratorium on the development of these systems. Recently, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and others signed their name to this proclamation that called for, I think it was a 6 or 12-month moratorium, essentially asking governments to intervene and say, let's stop this until we know what we're doing. Some of the top developers of AI, one guy named Joffrey Hinton, who is referred to as the godfather of AI, he resigned from his job at Google because he said, I don't know what we're doing and I want to be free to criticize this because I think we're heading in the wrong direction. Recently, Eliezer Yudkowsky, he's been working on AI development, on the problem of AI alignment for decades. And he published an article in Time magazine. I think this is important. It wasn't published on his Facebook page. It wasn't published on some fringe chat group or anything like that. It was published in a reputable magazine called Time magazine. And this is here's what he said. He says, the key issue is not human competitive intelligence. It's what happens after AI gets to be smarter than us. Key thresholds there may not be obvious. We definitely can't calculate in advance what happens. What happens when a research lab would cross the critical lines. Many researchers steeped in these issues, myself included, he says, expect that the most likely result of building a superhumanly smart AI system is that under anything remotely like the current circumstances, that literally everyone on Earth will die. Again, that's a fairly strong words from a person who spent his entire life studying this. And he was, again, calling for interventions to try and put a stop to this. So those are just some of the threats that we're facing. There's several more that we could talk about, but the book says, when we take all of these threats to the society that we're living into consideration, Toby Ord and the University of Oxford think we have a 1 in 6 chance of surviving the next century. Moving on beyond that, the book doesn't even Toby Ord and the Future of Humanity Institute doesn't even look, I think, at some of the more basic elements that might be causing societal collapse. Not necessarily perhaps extinction level events or existential risks to humanity, but other risks that are obvious and that are going to change the society and we live in. For example, one of the things that I think is very, very important to mention is that the idea that our global economy is absolutely committed and wed to this issue of unlimited economic growth. We've talked about this in past classes about how, in essence, our global economic system is akin to cancer. What our economic system is to the world is the same as what cancer is to the human body. Anything that grows without any sort of limits or boundaries or restraint is going to cause damage to the wider system. The image here to the right is a book that was written back in 1972. It was a study done by a number of economists and sociologists, and it was called The Limits to Growth. And it was written back in 1972 when all of these economists were starting to come together and see that it was illogical to pursue unlimited growth in a finite ecosystem, a finite world. There is not an unlimited amount of resources, of energy, et cetera, and we have to come to terms with that. The problem is that every politician, every political party, from the right wing to the left wing to the center, everyone is absolutely committed to this idea of unlimited economic growth. It's kind of seen as our preordained destiny, and that we're going to continue to pursue this. And that economic model is what's driving all of these ecological crises, but it is going to end. Another thing is, we've talked a lot about peak oil. That's something that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. And so, for example, there's all this information about what happens when we hit peak oil. When are we going to hit it? But one interesting statistic, I think, is something called energy return on energy investment, or EROI. And that's essentially, in order to get fossil fuels, in order to get oil or gas or coal, we have to invest energy to get that out. Several years ago, the rate of that was 100 to 1. So we would take 1 barrel of oil, for example, and we would get 100 barrels of oil in return. That declined to 30 to 1 in the 1970s, and it's 10 to 1 in the year 2000, and it's around 6 to 1 right now. So essentially what we've done is all of the easy to access fossil fuel deposits, the oil that was right underneath the surface, what they call conventional oil, the coal that was, relatively near the surface of the earth, all of that's gone. Now, in order to get coal, they're doing mountaintop removal mining, which is essentially dynamiting entire mountains to open them up. To get the remaining natural gas and oil deposits, we're doing fracking, which is essentially breaking apart the rock that's underneath the earth to get to the deeper deposits. And all of that takes much, much more energy. And that too is diminishing. And I think that's extremely important for us to understand. It's also important to understand, I think, that the earth, that the fossil fuels that we've been using for the past 200 years are a concentrated source of energy that cannot be replicated, at least in the current state, by the renewable energy resources we have on hand. There's certainly a place for solar panels and wind turbines and geothermal energy and things like that, but there's a reason that there hasn't been a 100% shift. And we're not going to make a 100% shift because those sources of energy are not as concentrated, they're not as abundant. There's all these issues with, how do you prevent, how do we store that energy? How do we disperse it? And we're never going to come across a energy resource like what we've had with fossil fuels. William Catton was another person who wrote in the 70s and 80s, another ecologist, and he wrote a book called Overshoot, saying that our primary ecological problem is that we consume too much. We're like a species that has overrun its boundaries. And whenever that happens, he says that we've become a detrivore, which he calls Homo colossus. Our species bloomed. We've taken over this enormous, pretty much every ecosystem around the world. But we must expect a crash. And this, in terms of human ecology, the idea is that human beings are animals. We are a high order mammal. But as a mammal, as an animal, we are subject to the same ecological laws as every other living species, on this earth. And, with every other, species, we see all these examples of species that, came into an environment and started to take it over and consume more resources than their fair share. And they grew and they grew and they grew, and then boom, they collapsed. So in human ecology terms, we might be expecting that as well. So peak everything. This is a graph that what happens when the resources available to us, not just energy resources, obviously we've talked about fossil fuels, but all of the other intermediate resources that we need. So for example, if we're going to really try and transition to renewable sources of energy, that still means that we need enormous amounts of lithium, of steel, of copper, of all of these rare earth resources that are necessary for solar panels, for electronics, etc. All of these resources are declining. And so in a basic peak everything scenario, what happens is the resources decline, the population grows until the resources are gone, and then shortly afterwards, the population begins to follow this decline in resources. This is a graph that isn't just applicable to human societies. It's applicable historically to how past civilizations have grown and collapsed. It's applicable to other animal species, other plant species that have done the same thing. Again, referring back to the limits to growth study that I mentioned earlier, this was done by a team of MIT scientists, and they argued that industrial civilization was bound to collapse if we continued this, same case scenario. The report's most infamous scenario, which they called business as usual, predicted that the world's economic growth would peak around the 2040s and then take a sharp downturn along with the global population and other, similar issues such as food availability, natural resources that we can use. And this imminent collapse wouldn't be the end of the human race, but rather a important societal turning point that would see standards of living drop around the world for decades. I think it's interesting because just last year, there was a graduate student in Holland called Gaia Harrington who looked at this study in depth and tried to follow, all of these predictions of what the limits to growth team thought was going to happen. And she said, from everything I see, the indicators that they were following are right on time. We haven't changed. We're continuing along the business as usual scenario. And this deadline of the 2040s of when economic growth is going to stop and a downturn is going to come, we're right. We're following the path line that they have laid out, is what she wrote. Perhaps going back to this issue of energy, I think it's important to mention that when this downturn does occur, one of the biggest shifts that we're going to find is that we have less energy. And so most of, most governments, most politicians, all of the leaders of commerce and industry and technology, when we look at these two pictures, they focus and they believe, I think seriously, that our human future is going to look like this. Something from that kids cartoon show called The Jetsons, something where we're going to be flying in cars, everybody's going to have their own flying airplane, we're going to live in this amazing urbanized society where all of everything we want is just at the push of a button. This kind of this fantastic future. If this were to occur, we obviously need to have a source of energy and a source of resources that are essentially unlimited. And everything that, all evidence that we see, everything that we've learned, that history shows us, everything that, modern economics shows us, is that that's not happening. That energy is limited, that resources are limited. And so if we are not going to live in a future where we have an unlimited energy surplus, that means we're going to have to live in places where there are limited sources of energy. And so this picture on the right is a picture of villages around the parts of El Salvador where I live. This is from a village just over the hill from where I live. And it's something that is, found and similar to places all around the world. A lot of times when you look at a picture like this, a village from the 800s, or a village from, the year zero, or from the, before the Industrial Revolution, life did not change that much. There were small scale urban civilizations that rose and fell, but essentially people lived close to the land. They spread out of the landscape because of the lack of any source of concentrated energy, in the source of fossil fuels or nuclear energy or whatever it might be. Because they did not have that, people had to spread out of the landscape and use the free energy resources from the sun, from the wind, and things like that. Because we did not have concentrated sources of energy, we needed to live spaced out. There was only so there was a size limit to how large urban spaces could grow. There was restraint required based on how much sunlight was available, how much energy could be procured from the local landscape. So I think when we look at these two pictures and we say, what is our future going to look like? Most people would say the picture on the right, this one here, is a picture of our past, and this here is a picture of our future. I would say that perhaps, given the realities that we're facing, this might be a picture of the future that we never achieve, and this might be a picture both of our past and of our future. Let's take a real quick look at the history of collapse. Like I mentioned, one of the things that I think is interesting is that people who live in modern times, we think that we are special, that we live in a time that is, obviously different than other, times throughout history. But at the same time, people who lived in the Roman Empire probably thought the same thing, about their times. People, who lived in the golden age of the Mayan empires here in Central America probably thought that they lived in a pretty unique time as well. But the Roman civilization collapsed. The Mayan civilization collapsed as well. And so, there's been a fairly large rising interest in this history of collapse, how past civilizations have risen and fallen throughout the centuries. Perhaps one of the more famous books was written by an author called Jared Diamond, called Collapse. And he identifies 5 different factors that contribute to collapse throughout history: a changing climate, hostile neighbors, collapse of essential trading partners, environmental problems, and the society's response to the 4 factors above. Obviously, today, climate change is on the mind of everyone. Hostile neighbors, and today, when we talk about hostile neighbors, we're not just talking about the people who live in the next village, or the people who live on the other mountain range. We're talking about on a global scale now. So pretty much, any country that we don't get along with, every terrorist organization that might exist on the fringes, the threat of global violence is much more palpable today, perhaps, than it was in the past. Collapses of essential trading partners today in our global economic system. All of us rely every day on supply chains that are incredibly complex and long. And one of the reasons that they say that Tikal, which was one of the major cities here in the old Mayan Empire, one of the reasons that it collapsed is because these trade routes essentially collapsed. And so that, the old Mayan Empire that required bringing in food and water and firewood to these urban centers, once those collapsed, the city collapsed as well. And I think that we can say that, our global economic system today is extremely vulnerable to all sorts of different situations. I mentioned in a past class, I don't know if you all remembered, several years ago, there was one of these major cargo ships that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And it was so big, it stopped traffic of all of these cargo boats. And essentially it interrupted, these global supply chains, something so simple as a ship that got stuck in a river. And all of a sudden people were not able to, to depend on these global supply chains, which are always, as they say, just in time.
Tobias Roberts?
Yeah.
Are you aware of the situation with the Panama Canal right now?
No, would you like to?
Well, there's a drought going on in Honduras, and
Okay.
so there's not enough rain to fill the docks, and so the amount of goods passing through the Panama Canal has been reduced by about 50%.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's another great example, I think, of how vulnerable we are to even the smallest shifts, right? So again, Jared Diamond was talking about the collapse of past civilizations, but these four or five factors, I think we can look at them and see that there are obviously modern day parallels as well. um I see it's 9:42 at my time, so I'm going to try and hurry up real quick. Again, looking at the lowland Maya, which is the part of the world where I live, one of the things that I think is interesting is that when we talk about collapse, uh, when I lived in Guatemala, when people talked about the collapse of the Mayan civilization, a lot of the local communities didn't like that. They said, "What collapse? We're still here." People in Guatemala today still speak, the Mayan languages. They still have their own cultures, their civilizations, which are directly tied to these ancient civilizations. And so what happened, when Tikal and all of these other urban centers started to fall, started to crumble, it's not that everybody died. It's not that all of a sudden there was this massive disappearance of population. What happened was people spread out. They said, "Well, we had a good go of it, right? We enjoyed urban life for a while," and then they spread out over the landscape. They started to colonize all of these different mountain ranges and in uninhabited jungles and things like that. And so people spread out over the landscape due to the overexploitation of resources, climate change, and the complexity of urban societies. Um, I think a question that we have to ask ourselves today is, going back to these two images here. If we're not going to be able to live in these concentrated societies that are so threatened by all of these possibilities of collapse, are we willing, as a society, to go back to a life like this, to an area where we spread out over the landscape, try and capture local sources of energy, utilize local resources as sustainably as possible?
Yes.
So, yeah, are we? I hope that we are. Um, and I guess that gets back to this issue of how development organizations respond to the communities we live. And I think that unfortunately, the vast, many billions of dollars that are poured into the development industry are focused on trying to help poor people achieve this, move towards the urban areas, introduce themselves into the global monetary economy, become more competitive. I'm not saying that there's not a place for some of those programs, but I think what we might need to focus on is how to help rural pupils, how to help marginalized populations, how to help people that we consider to be poor to live well in these places, right? To continue this tradition, this civilization of living well in place. And I would say perhaps even maybe what we need is to reverse funding. Instead of wealthy people from cities going into rural areas and preaching about what development is, maybe we need to open up some spaces where rural villages that are thriving can go into urban areas and say, "Look, this is how you all should live." We've never talked about that. I think that might be important. Um, we're running out of time here. I took a little bit longer, but here, let me just end here with these last couple slides. I'm going to skip over the complexity thesis, just mention real quick that if you're interested in this subject, one of the best books is by an author called Joseph Tainter. He's an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and he did another great book and essentially said that societies always tend to collapse. Civilizations always tend to collapse when they become too complex. As they become too complex, what he says is that the cost benefit analysis, it becomes too expensive to maintain the complexity of a society. And so what happens is people essentially unwind complexity, spread out over the landscape, and try to survive, in other ways. Uh,
Tobias Roberts, I,
yeah.
I want you to come back and finish up this. So I want you to come back and do like a part two on this subject because
Okay.
this is so important to understand the world.
I agree. I agree. I appreciate that. Um, so here, should we talk about this? Well, we'll skip the Roman Empire real quick.
One thing. I don't know if you're familiar with the Mondragon Cooperative in Spain.
Yeah. I've heard of them.
So
Yeah.
when they started out, the father there, Mondragon, said, "Okay, what we're going to have is we're going to have set a salary that the person who makes the most amount of money can make no more than 3 times what the lowest person is making.
Uh-huh.
And then eventually they had to raise when they got a huge corporation, they had to raise that to 6 to 1. And I think nowadays it might be 10 or 12 to 1 because there's so much competition to pull
Sure.
away their managers to other businesses. But to me, that was just a great way to make sure that everybody was taken care of and participating.
Yes. Yes, I
What
agree.
do you think something like that could actually stabilize the world?
I mean, I think that, one of the things that we haven't touched on is that I think another perhaps threat of collapse is just the burgeoning inequality that we see. I mean, you can look at the numbers that what percentage of billionaires owns, manages the amount of resources. I mean, that's an issue, right? And the Mondragon Cooperative, I think, is an example of how you can create thriving local businesses, giving local people a stake. And like I said, this ideal here doesn't mean that we all have to be farmers. It doesn't mean that we all have to go back to simple subsistence living. I think what it does mean is that we have to find ways to live more sustainably in place. Given all of the complexity, all of the threats that we face. Instead of continuing along this path, how can we live more sustainably in place? And in creating local cooperatives that give people meaningful employment, that try to manage inequality in a way that allows some sense of social cohesion in the places where we live. I think that's an extremely important aspect. Uh,
Tobias Roberts, would you say that in the maybe in the couple of decades that are left to kind of pull this together, that people around the world should fight for infrastructure and schools and education?
yeah, no, certainly. I think that what one of the things that I heard recently in the podcast was that we're going to look back in 100 years now, and our grandchildren are going to say, "Man, they were stupid." We had this amazing resource of fossil fuels that we were able to tap for a couple 100 years, and look how we wasted it. We wasted it on SUVs and meaningless cross country flights and all these other things, right? And like we still have fossil fuels. It's not they're not gone completely, right? So how could we like use some of the remaining energy surplus that we have to create a more sustainable society, right? And so yeah, there I think there's all sorts of local infrastructure that we can create. Perhaps we could understand that we are going to have a lower energy future. But if we were to, have government policies that invested in local renewable energy centers for local communities, where we could have perhaps a decentralized grid where every locality managed their own energy resources, perhaps a small hydroelectric dam providing water and energy to local communities. Obviously, it's going to depend on every locality. Schooling, infrastructure for decent schools, and then also how you change education so that education isn't about trying to convince young people that we need to believe in this Jetson-like future, but the education as preparing people for living well in place. Right? I think that is a challenge that in the majority of cases, most schools, most public schools today, especially in rural areas, kind of do the opposite, encourage young people to escape their regions, their localities, instead of finding ways to make them better, improve them, and allow people to live well in place, right? Um, to end real quick here, so what does all this have to do with development? So, given all of the threats we face, the historical tendency that complex civilizations always collapse, uh, how might collapse be a welcome opportunity to redistribute ourselves into decentralized, more egalitarian, more environmentally friendly ways of societal organization? I think instead of seeing collapse as, oh, we all need to buy our guns and build our bunkers, maybe we should see it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to perhaps right the ship, live more fulfilling, sustainable lives in community where we can contribute together. We might not have, all of the money we have, all of the resources we have. We might have to accept some limitations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to live, in scarcity and in starving. We're all going to be fighting each other for the last bit of meat or whatever. Um, David Fleming, who is here's a couple quotes. He says he's a great author from the UK. He says that localization, this return to the bioregions that sustain us, At the limit, it stands at best at the limits of practical possibility, but it has the decisive argument in its favor that there will be no other alternative. We are going to have to return to our places and live well in our places because we're going to have a lower energy future. So because that's one of our only alternatives, we better start learning about how to do it well. Simone Weil wrote that to be rooted is perhaps the most important but the least recognized need of the human soul. Rooting ourselves to communities, to the land, to local geographies is something that is profoundly important, not only in a practical sense, but also in the sense of how we can flourish as human beings, how we can find meaning, how we can find community, friendship, family, etc. And lastly, development, I think in that sense, should not be about economic growth per se. It should not be about introducing people into the monetary economy. It should not be about even improving standards of living. It should be about helping people belong best to their place. Wendell Berry says that the soil is the great connector of our lives. And obviously the soil is the essence of every place. The soil is the source and destination of all. It is the healer and the restorer and the resurrector by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for the soil, we can have no life. And lastly, here's one more, perhaps ending on a romantic note with poems and poetry. Rainer Marie Rilke was a German poet about 100 years ago or more. And he wrote a lot, even back in the 1800s, I think is when he was writing. He wrote about this idea of collapse, and he wrote kind of this romantic notion about people who avoided the temptation to move into the cities, the temptation that comes with economic growth. And he said, "Blessed are those who never turned away from the land. Blessed are those who stood quietly in the rain. Theirs shall be the harvest, for them the fruits. They will outlast the pomp and the power of lawmakers whose meanings will crumble. When all else is exhausted and bled of purpose, they will lift their hands, those that have survived." So I'm going to leave it at that and open up the floor for anybody who would like to share.